Welcome to another episode of the Rent Report, all things in the rental industry. I am your host, Mackenzie Wilson. Alongside me, I've got Hart Togman out in beautiful Ontario. This is a fun episode. It is everything to do with 2024 biggest trends we saw, the biggest stories of 2024, the rental market here in Canada. Hart, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. I love that you always point out that Ontario is beautiful. And I think, you hear a beautiful BC, beautiful Alberta, and big sky, and Ontario never has a defining feature. So it's nice. We're doing good and we're in the holiday period. So I think everyone's in good spirits. Thankfully, slow rental market, but with holidays, everyone's still smiling at us, even though they're buried with a little sentiment of others. We're doing good.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe it's a little tongue in cheek how I do that, but the introductions, yeah, we're talking in the virtual room or just getting ready to record this episode and reflecting on what a year's been in 2024 and some of the major changes. And I think if I was to recap 2024 in simply one sentence, it would be we're seeing the tip of the iceberg and what to come for 2025. And I see it as two major areas. I was looking at what AI is doing, and there's so many facets we can get into with that, which we will. And I think a very positive trend that seems scary right now, especially if it catches you off guard, is transparency and how that's coming in and impacting the market. And we can also get into that. Art, you had some good economic look backs as well when you're kind of putting your list together of your top trends for 2024.
Yeah, for sure. And so we'll go through each one in detail, but I would say on our end, there's a little element of surprise. And ultimately, it's not that this year shouldn't have been foreseen, but coming out of a lot of years of very intense rental market growth, rents skyrocketing, cheap money, a lot of investment, a lot of investors were taken by surprise with the way that the rental market turns. So we've got kind of five key factors to look at, the supply, turnover, rent growth, affordability, quality of tenants that we'll go through one by one. But ultimately, it is a surprise to a lot of investors how difficult this year was. And I think it paints a picture of what's to come in at least Q1 and Q2 of next year. We're all crossing fingers that things improve, but I think we're in an era now where we're going to reach some stability and we're not going to see massive roller coaster fluctuations. So this should be a fun conversation to kind of dig into each element of the market. And I think your point about transparency and AI is an amazing point to start because those are things that are not going to go away, right? We are moving towards an age of innovation and things are escalating quite quickly when it comes to software and innovation within the rental space.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, Hart. And something I'm kind of curious to get your thoughts on in terms of as I had some time to think here, we're looking through from the market perspective you're bringing is 2024 had the presidential election for the US. And what does that mean for Canada? I think there's a huge Trump factor that we have to understand, which then will relate into our Bank of Canada. They just did another massive decrease, a 50-point basis drop, which I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and what that looks for 2025. Not trying to tie in a lot of politics, but those politics do have, what would you say, certainly a level of influence indirectly into how our market operates on the rental industry. But particularly, we just seen the deputy minister of finance. Am I doing that right? Basically, the second in command under our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Christopher Freeland, resigned unexpectedly with a letter this week. So we're recording this is December 19th, 2024. And that has created a lot of uncertainty internationally, looking at our ability as a country to weather the storm and put ourselves in the best place going forward with governments and policy. I think we're actually, if you look at all the G7 countries, we're dead last or second to dead last from a GDP growth perspective. We've basically been flatlined. So that has a lot of weight on impacting all of the major industries and markets across Canada.
Yeah. And I think it's an interesting sentiment because Obviously, there's some political turmoil that is expected with a new president coming into power. And at the same time, we have not to talk politics, but we have a relatively weak leadership at the moment, proven by the fact that this deputy prime minister and head of the economic growth or lack thereof in the country has said, I'm done, right? Enough of
Don't
it.
agree with you. I'm out.
Yeah. And I think that sentiment is what we're seeing across the board. We're seeing investors who have been beaten down year over year with new legislation, with more difficult financing options available, just a general negative sentiment towards investors and landlords in general. A lot more landlords that we've been in touch with have just said, I'm done, I'm out, right? I've tried to invest in my country. I've tried to really push the needle, but the cards are stacked up against me now. And so we're seeing some of that departure or sentiment towards departure, at least. I think a lot of people like to talk for quite some time before they do take action. But that's probably the biggest one where we're seeing people fed up and just give up a little bit. I think the economic trends that we've seen in 2024, aren't necessarily directly impacted by some of the changes in the political spectrum, because I think the bureaucracies are really in charge of the country, and those don't change with a power shift. But ultimately, it's very clear that our economy is weak. And because of that, there is, a lack of condos being sold. And so therefore the rental supply goes up. There's low turnover because tenants don't want to move. With rent control in place in Ontario, that puts extra pressure on those tenancies that do turn over. So rent starts to escalate that much more aggressively for turned over units. And so affordability goes out the window. And so a weak economy in general does not bode well for both the investors, the condo developers, the large scale infill developers, and the tenants. And I think that's what we're walking into in 2025 from what we've seen in 2024, at least.
Yep. I agree with you, Arthur. I do see a lot of those things playing out. And I think it's really interesting because, like, I think probably actually not. I'm gonna throw us a point up. So we'll wrap up the economic. Let's do your end, and we'll wrap up. We'll go with my two biggest takeaways. And this is super unique. I remember reading about this. We had speaking on a growth, or it's probably the proper term for it, but our GDP growth in the country was still on an uptick. But when you break that GDP growth in Canada over 2024 on a per capita basis, on an individual basis, everyone will probably agree with this. Life felt a lot more expensive this year, and it's felt like we've either flatlined or even worse, we've progressed and decreased in that quality of life because the cost of living has increased on a lot of the major spending categories: transportation, housing costs, food, and we've never really been in that kind of environment where our GDP nationally has gone up, but individually we're far less productive, or even worse, we're stagnant and decreasing. So now we've just seen the biggest cost center of managing rental housing stock and providing that is debt servicing and the mortgage side of the business. And so the Bank of Canada just announced another 50 base point decrease, or half a percentage, and they're predicting another 2 more decreases next year. Again, timing's, of course, that's the crystal ball. So we're seeing the most expensive cost center or line item on a rental property, your debt servicing, decrease. So it's going to make it really interesting next year that more people will want to get in. I do think it's a positive sign that the government this year also decreased immigration numbers across the country. I know that you guys are seeing some rent decreases. I'm kind of curious to see, actually, from an Ontario perspective, how that's being impacted. We still do have that affordability crisis, and I think overall, if you're a homeowner or investor and you've been in this market for some time, at least greater than 5 years for sure, you're still in a very strong position. And these things are well, on the internet, it does soften some of the numbers. It's still, I think, a positive thing going forward that we need in the country.
Yeah, for sure. And so maybe that's a good place to jump into kind of the 5 economic trends that I've been seeing. The first is really increased supply of rental apartments, condos. And so, like you just said, rents have been slowing over the last 6 to 9 months. But at the same time, the increase in rental supply has made things even more dramatic for investors. Looking at the numbers, there was over 6,000 new units on the market this year, October to October, versus 3,200 October to October of 22 to 23. It's the highest number of new purpose-built rentals on the market in 30 years, well above the 10-year average, almost double. And so, looking at that stat, you'd think that the rental market is healthy, right? All this new supply is dropping on the market, but it's at the same time as all of these other factors are taking place. Ultimately, yes, there's a lot of purpose built, but what does that do to the condo market where new condos are dropping on the rental market because investors who bought them with the idea of flipping them pre-closing can't sell them anymore, right? So people are holding these rentals as a stopgap to selling them eventually. And now there's a massive oversupply that needs to be filled, and that's going to continue to drive rents down. So that's kind of the number one thing that we've seen. And then coupled with the number two, where there's been 12% turnover. And that 12% turnover has accounted for 40% of all the rentings. So as a baseline, usually year over year, we're looking at 20% turnover across all of the rental housing in Canada. That's a healthy number. So 1 in 5 units turns over on an annual basis. 12% turnover may sound great. You're keeping good tenants in place, but ultimately it's really showing that affordability problem. Those who don't have to move are moving. And when it comes to a rent controlled environment, those who are moving are bearing the brunt of the need for more rent, right? Because people are in those variable mortgages. They're just starting to come down now, but they are bearing the brunt of those rent increases. So 12% of the turnovers accounting for 40% of the rent increase really causes an issue with affordability. And the slow rent growth is number 3. So with slow rent growth, this is different per market, but really we're looking at like the large urban centers, Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto, Calgary. We're looking at about 2.5% rent growth year over year compared to previous years, which is almost at 9%. And you may say, well, things are still going well, right? Because we've got 2.5% rent growth. But ultimately, when you look at the cost of living, the cost of borrowing, that's not even close to keeping on track with the cost of money. So the rent growth is not keeping pace, and investors are not able to make the numbers work, and they're moving elsewhere. They're selling properties. They're placing lower quality tenants with an attempt to just fill vacancy and fill their costs. So we need to be conscious of the fact that rent has stabilized. Because if you're looking out to 2025, we're not expecting a massive roller coaster of price increasing, right? We should be maintaining that 2.5% rent growth relatively consistently. Maybe it'll move up a little bit, but until that oversupply from, number one has been filled, we're not going to see dramatic rent growth coming through the door. Number 4 is affordability. So to my point beforehand with slow rent growth, again, you can argue, well, affordability must be looking better. But the reality is for those that are turning over units, those tenants that have to leave, they're bearing the brunt, and affordability is yet to improve. And with a weak economy comes weak wage growth. Right? So inflation is still relatively up there. The Bank of Canada is trying to push down those interest rates to help out from an inflationary perspective. But ultimately, wage growth has not kept pace with rent growth or the affordability metrics. So 2.5% is not even digestible because the jobs aren't there. And I think a crazy stat was about, 40%. There's a 40% of all of the new jobs that were created were government jobs, or 35% of that 40%. Sorry, maybe misquoting, but a massive amount of the jobs created in Canada were just government jobs.
Really? That's not good.
Exactly. Right. So it's an attempt to really stem the issues, stop the issues that are happening. But ultimately, affordability is still a massive issue and was for the entire year. And then what that leads into is the 5th trend that we've seen, which is low quality of tenants, right? When you've got an oversupply and not a lot of tenants moving and bad affordability, those that are surging are going to be lower quality tenants. And as everything gets more expensive, people fall into collections. People have to spend more on rent than otherwise. So the rent and income ratios start to get skewed. credit starts to get impacted when people have late payments and whatnot. And so actually the partnership that we have with Single Key, about 6 months ago, we looked at the average application that came through the door, and it's still trending negatively in general. Credit is not great. Collections amounts are increasing, bankruptcies are increasing, and the rent to income ratio is almost up to 40%. And then what that leads to is an increase in fraud, right? Because when more desperate people need to get into more expensive properties, they need to look better. And I think the crazy stat that we had with you guys at Single Key was 2.5, 3 years ago, we were at 2% of all applications had an element of fraud. Then we saw that double to 4. We saw that double to 8 last year, and we're well into double digits. All applications have fraudulent elements to them. And that's what we've seen. And there's been reports from Menkes and other players on the market where 50, 60% of all applications have an element of fraud. So there's a massive issue there that needs to be solved. And I think rightly so, to your point, it's going to be solved with transparency and AI-based tools and innovation within the space. And so all of these economic factors are going to lead to the industry trends that are pushing towards innovation.
And love it. Love it. I have so many thoughts as you went through that list. I've just been writing down my notes here. Yeah, it is such a tough environment, especially if you're a renter. I think, looking back, actually, you brought up a great one. This is probably at an all-time high. I'd say, especially in Vancouver and Toronto, are two most expensive rental markets where the rent to income ratio is probably the highest it's ever been. The general prevailing best practice has always been about 1/3 of your income goes towards your rent. But now I would even say we're north of 50%, especially in the Vancouvers and the Torontos, which is absolutely staggering and hard to live quality of life, which is so unfortunate for a number of Canadians. I think you painted a really great picture too, around discussing how when we have rental turnover and we're between tenancies, the homeowner or the rental house provider is increasing rent to get back to market parity. But unfortunately, especially in rent control jurisdictions like yourself in Ontario and we'll say BC as well, because there's a fear if you don't know how long you'll have your next tenancy for, not only are you going to go back to market parity, you're going to go past market parity and charge a premium because you're going to be worried again that eventually you're going to be behind the 8 ball with rent control in place. And you're 100% right, Hart, that the brunt of the cost of taking on the supply and demand in the market is only by the tenants doing tenant turnover, which is why I'm very much a free market supporter. And what we do in Alberta is everyone in the rental market in Alberta bears the brunt of the increases and the decreases in the cost of rent. And it just makes it a lot easier pill to swallow if the whole population's doing it, instead of where you put an artificial influencer into the market and only a small segment of the market has to absorb a very costly change in the rent. Well, you've got some renters where they've been in a property for maybe a decade now, 15 years or longer, and they are not even half of what current market rents are. It just creates a very unbalanced environment.
And
So
I think it,
I know it's my soapbox preach there.
well, and I think it toxicity as well. And I mean, it's anecdotal, but when we post listings out on Facebook Marketplace, local Facebook groups that have an element of forum in them, we often get chastised for the rents that we're posting on behalf of owners. And lots of comments come out saying like, holy hell, I live down the street and I pay $1,000 a month or $1,500 a month for the same 3-bedroom main floor, and you've got it listed at 2,800. You're a terrible landlord. How could you, monopoly man? And that really just illustrates exactly what you just said.
Public sentiment.
Yeah, and it makes the industry toxic, right? It pits landlords and tenants against each other versus, like you said, in Alberta, everyone bears the brunt of those industry or the market changes.
Yeah. And so it's a lot more formal. It's another way I would look at it, and I've had a lot of these conversations, is where insurance came from back in the I want to say if this get this right, my high school or maybe my college education on economic history, insurance came around with the farmers, and during the Industrial Revolution, realized it's better to band together and pay a small premium each year to then support each other if they had a drought or floods come through and their crops got wiped out. It's really that same kind of adage that the whole population should bear that brunt, and each individual pays a lot less than putting artificial rent controls of inflation, penalizing the people that have to move because of life circumstance change, whatever it might be. And there's another good point. Amazing conversation. Really enjoying this. It's yeah. All right. We'll get off a bit of the soapbox of and policy kind of perspective. You know what? Oh, I know what I wanted to say is especially in mainstream media, it is really a polarizing discussion of tenants versus landlords, homeowners versus renters. But I would actually argue in reality though, that's a loud. I'm not going to say majority. There's still a decent segment of the market, but I would say just as equally, there is a segment, and maybe even the majority at 60% here, of um, landlords and tenants that get it and understand and just want that really harmonious relationship or a mutually benefiting relationship, because we do need each other, and great tenants are an amazing pleasure. They really blew my eyes open when I got into this business of having a rental property years ago. It made it so much more enjoyable, and it's such value in being able to provide a place that someone is proud to call their home. Yeah. Okay.
Let's talk about transparency, because I think you brought up two amazing trends that are a product of the market over the last few years, right? It's not a coincidence that the market has been moving towards more transparency, towards more AI development to make screening easier, to make pricing easier, to make marketing easier. And we've talked about marketing a lot in this show before. What are you seeing on the transparency side in terms of what happened this year and what may be coming down the pipe?
Yeah. In one sentence, 2024 is the tip of the iceberg for what we're going to see for years to come in the market. There's a big pivot going on. So transparency is one of them. For anyone who's looked at buying real estate, sold a piece of real estate, for those of you who've never participated with our MLS data in Canada here, you can see all the previous rental history, not rental history, list prices of a piece of property, what time it went in the market, how long it sat in the market at that exact price point. Did it get down? Did they take it off? Whatever it might be. You've got a lot of visibility when you look at buying a piece of real estate. That element is now coming in the rental market, and I think this is a very positive thing. I definitely know a lot of my peers may disagree with me on some of the more mom and pop landlords, and I can kind of understand where they're coming from, and I can articulate why, but I will also talk about the factors that will make it okay. So what we're seeing now, and I want to say it's Zumper or some of the bigger listing platforms down in the States are now starting to track every time a homeowner or a property management company lists a rental property, what date that property went onto the market as a vacancy, at what price point it was listed at. And now they're going to start trending. So a renter, if I come on and I'm looking to rent what your properties are, I can see you listed a property, 2-bedroom condo, in, let's say last year it went for $2,000. And now this year in May, it might be a year later, your tenants moved off for the 1-year lease. And then instead of 2,000, you've gone up to a staggering $2,700 because that's where market's at. Or maybe because you were at 2,000, you were below market rents. I can see that you've done this giant increase. Now, what's going to be important in this conversation is going to put a little bit more pressure on you as the homeowner or the landlord or the property management company to justify that increase. But you should be able to justify it. Again, if you came from below market price or below market rents, then that's understandable. Plus, we've had rising costs, but now we're seeing decrease in costs. I could see that coming down. It's going to catch the individuals and the mom and pop landlords off guard that there's quite a big delta between what they're currently charging and what the market's at. And they're going to have to be prepared to have that conversation. And I'm not going to say it's going to cause a little bit of conflict, but it's going to make the negotiation perhaps a little bit tougher in your market depending on where you're at. So that's something that's coming. If you're aware of it, then you're going to have the conversations and the talking points to be prepared for that negotiation when it comes time to find that next tenant. The next biggest and on the second piece in this whole move to transparency, we've seen the first player come in a couple of years ago, namely Open Room, when we're talking about crowdsourced judgments against both tenants and landlords. I think this is very critical. I'm 100% a big supporter of this. I've been directly involved in this now over the last half decade. I've been brought into the media through the Edmonton Journal and some of the other big publications, because I do run the largest Facebook group in Alberta for landlords, asking about this. And really the long and the short of it is, if there is a searchable crowdsourced database on both the track record of a landlord and how they've operate their business, are they above board? Have they been taken to their local tribunal by the tenant? So essentially taken to the courts, if you will, just to kind of simply put it, because they have maintained a substandard property, they haven't done repairs, they are breaking the law in their jurisdiction. More and more tenants are now than ever challenging their landlords, as they should be, because the access to the justice is a lot more easily understood and a lot more affordable. But there's a great paper trail being generated of track records out there. And I think the public will at large will benefit from both sides. If you've got bad actors, whether they're landlords or tenants, they should be held accountable for the action. And that's been the general public kind of reaction when I've looked over the last 5 years of being involved directly and reading the comments on the forums, on the Facebook groups across the board, has been that general sentiment. But now what we're seeing is the private market and some individuals taking up this challenge of crowdsourcing this document and making it readily available. But what's different now is you've always been able to search for this information, but the ease of access and the friction to get to this information has been greatly reduced. The time to get this information is going from business days to now, in some cases, mere seconds from a search or minutes. So now you can make a more informed decision on both parties, whether you're going to rent to or rent from an individual, which I think is a great thing. And then, so anyways, back to you, Hart. Do you want to throw any comments, as I just kind of ripped on two major points there?
So I would completely agree with both sentiments. And I think on the data transparency front, I mean, obviously, as a company, speaking for other companies, we need to be careful in terms of avoiding collusion, essentially. There's been the case down in the States with YieldStar, and the Department of Justice is going after them. There's class action lawsuits that are starting up in Canada as well. But ultimately, the key there that you pointed out was publicly available information is okay, right? And the more that we democratize the information out there with platforms sharing that information, and having recent up-to-date information to go on, that will help small landlords. The big corporations, the big developers have been doing it for a long time, and they have enough volume internally to gather their own data. But as a mom and pop landlord with one or two units, there's never been a single source of truth. And so moving towards that transparency, I think, is an amazing feat to really bring equality to the landlord versus the big developer out there. And on the front of getting access to the information from court orders, I think it's just about time. And from my perspective, it's really a public versus private sector problem that existed before. Canly existed. There should have been every order uploaded to Canly that could be searchable. And it should have been done in a timely manner, because, if you're searching Canly for informational purposes from a lawsuit where you're digging in as a lawyer, trying to do information about your case in 6 months, that's one thing. But as a landlord searching for an applicant who's applying to your property, you need timely information. And if that tenant just went through the landlord-tenant board and has just been evicted, and it takes the government 6 months to upload that order, that tenant is in your house, and then it's way too late. And so the private sector is stepping in and saying, we are going to crowdsource this information that is available quickly and efficiently and easy to use, because Canly was not easy to use by any means. I think it's amazing. And I think we're seeing, Open Room pioneer it. There's other players that are getting involved. And the industry is likely going to grow with multiple players and fragment, and then it'll consolidate. And I think within a few years, we're probably going to look back at 2024, maybe even 2023 as really the infancy of this crowdsourced reporting structure, which is amazing for the small landlord.
Yeah, and to riff on the riff from my initial conversation around this transparency, I really see it as a net benefit for all the honest players in this industry. If everyone's entering in, whether you're a renter or you're a homeowner, and you are here and you're running your best practices, you're just you're coming in with the most positive intent that, hey, I'm just going to pay my rent. I'm just going to provide a great quality a rental for someone to be proud to call their home. And that's perspective, which I think is the vast majority. This transparency moves is only going to penalize the individuals that are the bad apples, the negative, ill intent players in this industry. And it's just going to make it harder and harder for them to do what they do. And it's going to have a really positive benefit, right? Because if everyone's just charging fair rent and maintaining a good property, then we're not going to be going through the less of the eviction product. Totally granted that there is an element of an affordability factor, but if someone is being honest and transparent, I've got amazing tenants, and I've had tenants reach out to me and say, "Hey, Mackenzie, I can't pay rent on the first for next month, but here's my payment plan. I'll pay X amount on the first, and then on the 15th or whatever it might be, I can do this and this to get caught up." Or we've seen cases come through at Single Key where we have we have landlords in our rent guarantee product where the tenant unfortunately has fallen on tough times. They've been let go perhaps, and they can't pay rent, and they've walked away. But we've been able to help maintain the landlord and cover that stopgap of losing rent for that month while they turn over the unit. And um, I can't see any homeowner or landlord or property manager out there being upset with someone who's being, hey, I'm sorry, I'm 8 months into a year lease. I can no longer afford it. I'm giving you at least 2 months update because I'm seeing where the things are. Anyone will work with everybody, and I'll say more times than not, most landlords, especially in the private side, anyways, will happily forgive and break a lease. They understand there's a little bit more work up front, but if they can go and replace that tenant with the next tenant coming in, and not be penalized financially by losing a month's rent while they still have mortgages, insurance, and taxes and all that fun stuff to pay, then everyone's going to work together. So that's kind of the positive side out of that for sure. This one's really interesting, and I really think this is definitely the tip of the iceberg. The AI impact and an influence to the rental industry. And this has so many layers, like peeling back an onion, that we can get into. Let's just address the elephant in the room and talk the most prevalent and stereotypical perceptions of what AI is going to do to the rental industry. So, like you said, Hart, there's PMs down in the States being sued right now. There's also a software prop tech or fintech company called RealSage, who is currently being investigated, where they basically use these large data sets and an algorithm, also known as AI, to rapidly and in near real time predict what rents should be. I am personally okay with that because what that's going to basically mean is it's going to be a much more reactive market, and it will benefit in certain market cycles will benefit, of course, the landlords more or the tenants more. So here's the analogy I give. You're looking for an Uber ride, and it's a random middle of the day work week, not close to any holidays, on Thursday night, almost at midnight, maybe it's 11:30. You're going to get a really cheap Uber ride from the airport back home or wherever you're going. Granted, if you're looking for that same Uber ride and it's New Year's Eve and it's 50 minutes past New Year's and you want to get home and wherever it might be or meet up with your friends, you're probably going to pay, 3x, 4 times what it normally costs for a fare just because of the high demand model. But if we can more accurately represent the supply and demand in its current state, then the market will self-correct faster. And depending on what cycle, you'll get a better benefit as either the buyer or the seller, so the landlord or the tenant, depending on which side you're looking at. Where we have huge concerns right now is if these platforms are getting such large market penetration that they are price fixing on a monopoly size scale. That is a huge problem, and that's a huge red flag. And absolutely, this is where even being the free market kind of proponent here, I 100% support market regulation, some governments coming in to ensure that these players are acting in a fair and transparent way. And that's what's being decided right now down in the States. We've got some of these players popping up here in Canada too. And very curious to see how that plays out. I really hope that the legislating and governing bodies and the government itself gets this right, because the better the markets can operate and self-correct, the better position everyone's in, and of course keep that unfortunate natural behavior of human greed element out of it, and remove that price fixing risk.
Yeah, I think you pointed something out that I hadn't thought about beforehand, which is amazing. And I think there's a hope from us, small landlords, that the big guys aren't going to ruin it, right? Because there's such a benefit to the small landlord to have transparent data, current and real time data. And if there is a broad strokes, legislation put in place, or if there is a wipeout of a lot of these data players that negatively benefits the small landlord because of a few bad players who are pushing greed, it'll really be a shame. I would imagine, though, with the pace and scale of AI coming to the market now, if there is a little bit of wipeout of one or two players, there's going to be 17 startups right behind them ready to go with different variations of that tool. And I think we're just entering probably the decade where transparent pricing is going to be available, right? You're going to be able to go online, and on any platform, you're going to have real-time suggested rent prices based on, marketed list prices, actual rented prices, very fine-tuned data points that will help people just price accordingly. And I think it'd be really cool to see like an Airbnb style pricing model where you've got pricing based on demand. I would love to take one of my properties and throw it up on the market and have it auction based, right? And just to see what would happen, and to see if the capitalist inside of me, like you were saying, you have, really benefits from a balanced market, essentially.
Yes, I'd like to call myself a social capitalist, if that's even a real thing. But
Fair.
I think, as I was thinking, as we're going back and forth hard, this is why these dialogues are so much fun, is with this transparency shift, these more increased data sets out there, AI penetrating the market. What's really happening from an individual perspective is we're lowering the barrier, and I don't want to use the word intelligence, but the knowledge and experience is being decreased from perhaps a college or a high school level down to a junior high elementary level, where it's making it easier and easier to follow best practices. And what that means is the barrier to enter the market is either a tenant or a homeowner. There's going to be less risk because the tools and information out there is going to make it easier to follow the process without making mistakes. And I think that's got a huge benefit for everyone. And that's just kind of knock-on effect that, man, I even thinking like 20, 15, 10 years ago, none of these tools were out there. It wasn't a game or a market to play in for the faint of heart. You really had to have a strong personality or trust your gut mentality to operate, because you really operated from a very closed, blind perspective with, prepare for the worst, hope for the best, kind of what's going on in the market perspective. And now that's so different. That was, and again too, I'm ripping here, but the AI part too is, I equate it to where we're at, just to give people perspective. This is going from dial-up internet to high-speed internet, and the prevalence of the internet blowing up, where you have all the things and how connected we are in society with social media, all this different stuff. That we're just on this cusp. I think the positive and the humanity will come through, where it will be more than a net positive experience. Unfortunately, don't get me wrong, there's going to be some bad apples out there that will use AI for their own personal benefit at the detriment of society, but few and far between.
And it brings me back to a story that I actually haven't thought about in probably 7 years. But
Ooh.
one of the earliest value adds that we had at Rent Panda was our rent assessment. And we would often upsell people on property management, because we would go into a property and an owner would say, I think I can get $1,700 a month for this unit. And we would say, like, we would know we could get 2,100 every day of the week for that unit. And we would say, let us manage the property. We'll get the rent that we know we can get. And you'll still, be better off after our management fees with the rent that we know that we can get. And this was 8 years ago. When I think about it in terms of the technology shift, it feels like 20 years ago, but this was only 7, 8 years ago, when people just had no idea. And especially in smaller markets, there's
Plus
not
comparables.
big volume, right? There's no comparables, or there's very few comparables, and it's, my friend Dan down the street rented his place out for this much, so the pace of change is astronomical, and I think that's where AI is really going to move us in the next 4 to 5 years. From your perspective, you are single key for all intents and purposes. You're many other things as well,
Yeah.
but seeing where tenant screening can possibly go with the introduction of AI is incredibly scary and incredibly cool. I mean, I think democratizing the ability to screen and all those points about rent pricing are equivalent and amplified when it comes to tenant screening. So I guess what have you seen over the past year in terms of AI's influence on tenant screening and maybe where it'll end up in the next 12 months?
Yeah, good question. It's a good question, Trevor. And I'll wrap up on that last, like this triple rift that we're on. But the point that I think with that market and just having the ability to be closer to what the true supply and demand is from a price point perspective benefits everyone. In your example, you're going to prevent homeowners from completely undervaluing what they should be renting out the properties for. That means they can cash flow better. That means maybe they're in a break-even place and they can still afford to keep the property in the market because now they can pay the mortgage. On the flip side, that's going to prevent an unsuspecting tenant that doesn't know the market. They're new to the country, new to the city. They moved in and accidentally overpaying by $300-400 on a property that is someone's just who has a better idea is, I want to say predatory, but it is over extracting the value of the market. Because like you said, it's so hard to do it. And in the small markets where there is no comparables, you don't know. And I would say more times than not, individuals fortunately leave too much on the table, or not too much on the table, but undersell what their value is, or and vice versa. So it really does benefit all the stakeholders, whether you're a renter or a homeowner, on both sides. To your question about the AI on impact and tenant screening and due diligence, it's kind of like a rose. If you grab the stem at the right place, you're not going to get pricked. But man, looking from the outside, it does look scary. It looks very thorny. And I'll break this apart. I think critically, the ethics conversation has to be addressed first, because that is the framework your decision making as a player in the market, as being Canada's biggest tenant screening provider, single key. And also my other positions, I have a landlord-tenant dispute business in Alberta, so we represent both parties going through the tribunal and what that looks like. I see that AI, ethically speaking, should be used to enhance the decision making by providing better quality data points to make the most informed decision possible. But that most informed decision possible should be made by a human, not AI. So AI should enhance the due diligence process. And again, this is going to benefit everyone. It's going to reduce risk. It's going to, again, make it so much harder for bad players, for that small minority that gets the ugly headlines that scares everyone in this market. It's going to make it much more difficult for them to participate, which I see as just a win-win or a net positive for everyone in the rental industry. I see AI being used in these smaller, what's the right word for it? Not segments, but smaller pieces of the due diligence process. So a very easy example is ID verification. Are you who you say you are? Or are you trying to fake me and pretend to be someone else and use identity fraud to get in my property because actually you're a well-known fraudster and never pay rent, or whatever it might be. And the positive side from the renter perspective, where I see this going for everyone, is there's going to be a need, or it's coming. And I see it, and I guess I'm already talking in the future here, but this it's going to protect the tenants a lot more, because now there's going to be a lot more proven, or know your customer, know your landlord, know your property management. They're going to have a much more higher quality online presence. And soon I see this coming into, if they are a bad actor in the industry, and I use this word so very sparingly, a slumlord, that information is going to become more and more readily available at the time you're making the decision to rent from this individual, allowing you to not rent to them, which is going to penalize them for their previous bad behavior. So AI is coming in. It's going to make ID verification a lot better. It's going to validate the information being presented. And you mentioned at the top of the show too, it's an unfortunate side effect of people in a really tough position Shelter is a basic need, and everyone 100% deserves and have that society. When we get into housing, a subset of shelter, shelter could, does shelter mean and affordable housing mean one bedroom condo, a space, a bed at the shelter, or an amazing penthouse suite with walk-in closets and all the amenities you could ever imagine? That's to be determined by society. What's happening is, dude, I had a great time. I got to edit this part out, but going back to it, the AI is going to allow these parties to come back together a lot cleaner. So we're going to, on the due diligence side, people say they make this much in rent, then they can do it. Yeah. So then, because it's a tough thing, with low vacancies and people are struggling to find places, they are inherently going to, self-preservation is going to come in, and they're going to bolster their rental application. They're going to make it a lot more appealing than what it is. Is it a black and white lie? No. Or maybe yes, I don't know. But maybe it's shades of gray if they're just fluffing the numbers a bit to look a little bit better than the competition so they can secure that rental. And understandably so, put yourself in their position. If you've got family, you've got dependents, that loved ones that you got to look after, you're going to do anything, everything to secure housing. And housing is such a key staple to living your quality of your life and being able to do the basic things you want to do, right? So we're going to clean that picture up. I think I'm really excited about that. And I see AI then also making that relationship a lot easier again between the tenants and the landlords through automated replies. And I know some people have some bad taste, and I do as well. I've gone on and talked to chat bots to get a service or something done with the business and not had a great experience. Again, we're in that dial-up phase, and we're going to get to that blistering, amazing high speed where you can do a lot of the basic customer needs to maintain an account with a service provider without the involvement of a human on the other side. And you can do it 24/7. And I see that coming into the rental market, quickly answering tenant requests on maintenance requests, getting basic information, whatever it might be. That stuff's all coming, which I'm very excited for. Like you said, it is scary thinking about the possible outcomes on a negative perspective. But I truly believe that the will of our society and human intent is for the benefit of all. And I really will see that will come out and make everything better for us.
Amazing. I would agree wholeheartedly. And I think, the one caution on the tenant screening side that we've seen and have always heard is what you pointed out at the start in terms of the decision being made should be made by a human based on, the asset that they have based on a specific situation. But the dissemination of information, the collection of information, that can be made a hell of a lot more efficient than it is right now. It takes a lot of work to push people through an application process to get the full picture of who they are, because everyone's situation is unique. And so if we had a way to really streamline that and put forward the information, that would make everyone's jobs a lot easier. And I think to your point earlier, reduce the barrier of entry, push small landlords to invest in more properties, get more quality housing, allow property managers to be more efficient, which means less resources needed, which means we can charge less for property management, which means more landlords can opt into property management, which means more properties professionally managed, which is ultimately better for the tenants.
Love it.
The efficiency, if you strip out the element of human greed, end up being better for both sides of the coin. And I really think that with any technology, whether it was the atomic bomb or AI, it's really the companies and individuals who utilize it pushing for a positive net in the industry is going to push good change, right? And we need to come together as a community to ensure that that happens, and that the inevitable bad players are not the leaders in the industry.
Or can get away with what they can. Yeah. I'll pivot on you mean atomic energy has the benefit of providing sustainable power to society, or it could be used for the intent of making destructive bombs. But yeah, absolutely hard. I really want, this is a great, this is why we do this. These conversations are fun. We're two industry nuts, perhaps a little bit of influencers. I love this stuff. That's why I got to write down notes while we talk, or try not to riff too much. There's another piece I really wanted to add into what you said, Hart, around, the impact of AI. Oh yeah. So I'm going to throw some shades of gray at you, and this is probably up for a future debate around the ethic concerns of AI affecting tenant screening and ultimately tenant selection. whether that might allow or prevent someone from attaining their next rental, which is their housing need, and their shelter eventually going back to the basic need. What's already happening right now, and this has been the norm, but it's being done manually and less efficient, is every homeowner, property management business, investor has a set of criteria that a tenant must need to meet. That is, they have to have a certain kind of income, track record, credit score, no bankruptcies, all these different factors. Those are really absolute metrics that they're numeric. I can pick that I won't accept a tenant below a credit score of 600. The public will be scared of is if we've got AI saying, I'm not going to rent to Jane or John. Where I guess I'm trying to articulate the human involvement here. I will probably expect that a business will take their own screening criteria and perhaps automate that, and that will then directly filter some applicants out or filter some renters out. Where I think is important, so that I don't quite know where I fit on that. I think, and I remember my other poor heart, and I'm all over the place here, but coming back to that oversights in governments and some of these, like, using AI to best understand supply and demand and pick the best price in that current market cycle, which will benefit one party over the other. That goes both ways. It kind of relates to Elon Musk's position on making X, formerly Twitter, the algorithm open source, so people can understand how conversations are being propagated and not being pushed for propaganda, but because there is truly a public or society desire to talk about that current thing that needs to have those conversations. If we open source the algorithm that then does the price setting for rents, I think that's a huge win, because everyone there's balance and checks put in place to ensure that algorithm is functioning as it's being advertised and it's not being used to price set and fix because they have a monopoly on the number of units in the marketplace. And then going back to the AI impacting how tenants may or may not get filtered out for a rental property. Again, if we have some transparency in place, it should be okay as part of the picture that the criteria you're using, and understandably so, there has to be a minimum financial requirement that tenants have for a certain property. Where I think it's super important going beyond that is that's only part of the relationship. This is a business relationship. The tenant has to be black and white. The easy part is they have to be financially sound to afford the product or the rental in question. The next part of it, this is a long-term business relationship, and there's a huge human element. That, do I want to work with this individual? Is this someone that, I'm being like I'm a tech-driven landlord or investor, I want someone that can pay rent online, that can text message, that can send me pictures to help me set up and do things quite efficiently, to do maintenance requests and other things. Doesn't mean the same renter that's financially sound, who might be retirement or just doesn't like doing texting and wants to pay rent through a check or cash or meet in person and rather pick up the phone to discuss maintenance requests, isn't my type of tenant. And that's where that human element is still critically important to be involved in this tenant placement process. And that cannot be replaced by the AI.
Well, I'll throw a catch in there and say a lot of what we originally envisioned as smart tenant screening tools were essentially algorithm based as opposed to true AI models. And I think a true AI model may get to the point of understanding your desires as a landlord, and then understanding the cumulative desires of landlords, which is probably more typically leaning towards renters who are tech savvy, who can help out with work orders, who can pay rent online, which means less delinquencies because they can't meet up on Sunday afternoon or whatever it is. When you start to implement a true smart model, that's where my fear comes in, where you may start developing biases that are unintentional. And I think it's a tough problem to solve, because it is one where a lot of people feel that, housing is a human right. I agree with you that shelter is a human right, but ultimately when
To define housing, it's such a subjective, and there's so much more facets. But yes, that's a whole other conversation another day. But yes.
And so when it comes to machine learning, making those decisions, or even pre-screening people out based on the predisposition toward this trait becomes very, very difficult. And I think no one has really cracked that yet. And I'm
No,
not surprised to hear that there are lawsuits starting up because of discriminatory beliefs from an AI model. And I think it's one that there's a lot of benefit to AI when it comes to providing the data, but even pre-screening is slightly problematic. And this is coming from someone who tried to build a smart screening tool years ago. And
yeah.
I think the fears around it were so that we really need an expert in the field to do this. I wouldn't trust, necessarily new players in the market to jump in. And I think there does need to be some government regulatory control. But it needs to be with a, you know, a private sector involvement as well.
Very much a collaborative approach, right? And it's great to hear because yes, we are both the investors. We're more of the right side, leaning across the scale. But here we are, both preaching for government involvement, and we don't want red tape. There's a very different, but we want thoughtful oversight and transparency with the right checks and balances, so the greed side of capitalism doesn't affect and destroy society through like the housing crisis that we're dealing with. And as like again, like, and I'm so curious in what you think about this stuff, Art. Like, yeah, it's scary. I think society will get it right with AI, and there's going to be some trial and error that is guaranteed, and there's going to be some unfortunate cases out there where some individuals will get burned as we make this transition as a society. I don't see it happening any other way. I'm not fearful, but I'm cautiously optimistic. I really hope that our governments get the regulation or the governance correct, the policies correct, and we don't negatively impact ourselves. I guess I have a fear where we will see some of these mistakes happen because this trial it's going to happen. But I hope that the public and the media does not take a knee-jerk negative position without really truly understanding where we're trying to get to and put up a roadblock or red tape that's going to detriment the industry as a whole. That's my concern.
Yeah, and I think that there's cross industry innovation that's available. We've for a long time we've seen tenant placement and HR software kind of overlap, right? One of the earliest players in tenant screening ended up migrating more heavily into employee screening. And a lot of the credit check, background check tools are one and the same. As an example, I think that there's benefit to even a simplified AI screening model. We recently hired for a leasing specialist, and it shows the state of the economy. We posted a job, and within about 48 hours, we had over 400 applicants. And we're a small company. We don't have the resources of an HR department to go through 400 applications. And my brain going through those applications became very in terms of how I'm evaluating someone, right? And I think having a basic AI tool to do that from an HR perspective and the same from a tenant screening perspective would help, because you post an ad for a reasonably priced property in downtown Toronto. Even in this market, you're still going to get 300-400 messages a day. And the reality is as a human being, and even as a property manager, you're going to get burnt out after the first 100, and you're not going to take into account the next 300.
Which is unfortunate.
Yeah, your own human capability is going to screen out those extra 300. And so there are immediate benefits to even a basic model. But when it comes to very definitive decision making on an individual applicant, there's a lot of work to still be done.
Yeah, and you gave me a product feature idea of that conversation, Hart, and then we talked about this for a while. But back to like this, the whole screen element is there's two things, right? There's the absolute black and white, the financial numbers. That part is easy once you figure out, once you know what your ranges are, which scares a lot of new landlords coming to the market because they don't really understand that. But getting beyond it is how do we bridge the software and the current best practices to allow tenants that are deserving, that might be that right human factor element and relationship fit for that landlord. How do they get their message across in an easy manner in a way that they can articulate their best qualities? I don't want to say it's like allowing the tenant to do a video of why you should pick me. But if we can fold some of the software through this process by asking the right questions to the tenant to allow them to get their best qualities on paper for the landlord, then when you've got 400 inquiries, you can almost systematically filter not only on the absolute black and white stuff, which we already know and do, but now you can quickly filter on the human element to bring the quality applicants tied with the right financial background profile to your short list. And I think that's an interesting conversation. And I'm going to throw this at you, Har, because I'm curious what you think. And I know we've gone on quite long, but this is kind of that, wrap up of 2024 and what's going forward is as these AI tools are penetrating the market, we're driving huge efficiencies, which means the market's going to move quicker and quicker and faster. And vacancies are going to, the time from a vacancy becomes open to the time it gets filled is going to become shorter and shorter and shorter. What going back to my concerns with I do 100% agree. We need governance and policy to come into place in legislation. Where I'm scared they'll get it wrong, and that's going to negatively affect, is they would create policy to solve a symptom and not address the root cause. And where I'm going with this is, so for example, AI is going to make, the whole tenant screening process, this whole process move quicker. And people are going to say, well, it's making it hard for me to find a rental, but the market doesn't have enough affordable rentals. So what's happening is they're going to create a policy to put in rent control, or I don't know, whatever it might be, that sounds great and gets votes, but actually is negatively impacting our industry and making it much difficult, more costly for everyone. What's going to happen is if we get these efficiencies going in the marketplace, it's just going to exaggerate and make it more apparent the root causes that we're struggling with. And one of them is affordable housing. And affordable housing is such a cheeky term, because what is affordable housing? You can ask 15 to 20 people and you'll get 15 to 20 different answers. But there is a need for our government to provide some form of this affordable housing. And I know it's such a prickly kind of BS answer. It sucks, because as we add more and more supply to the market, no one's adding cheaper, below market value housing, because we can't. The cost for construction, the cost to turn over a new unit to the big, we call it the missing middle, is the big player right now. And again, that could be another conversation. But quickly is this densification, where we're taking a piece of land zone for a single family house, knocking down that old house that might have been renting pretty cheap because it's old and run down, to adding 8 brand new high-end units. Yeah, okay. And so that then has higher rents. But the affordable element and the tenants on the other side of this conversation are absolutely right. There's less affordable units out there. That's not a private sector responsibility to solve. That's where we need our governments to come in and yeah. So it's a very complex subject.
Oh, and I think you made an amazing point about the innovation and transparency will lead to exposing the root problems. And, part of that is exposing the root problems to then create solutions. Some of them are going to be private sector, some public sector. I think creation of affordable housing is one. I think when you think about a tenant who doesn't get approved, bad credit is one that's there. There's slowly now a movement towards allowing an easier reporting of both good and bad rent payments to build some.
Yes, huge point.
And I think that's where, as you dig into it and expose the industry, solutions are put in place to help out, right? Even things like a guarantor by default only being liable for the term of the lease when a lease has no term end. Little pieces of legislation that just don't make sense. If there is an exposing of that as a core issue, it'll start to get chipped away from it. And I think public and private sector need to work together to solve those problems.
Amen. 100%. Love it.
Amazing.
Well, to wrap her up, we went over time. We did an hour and 10 minutes, and I think you're going to rip through a ton of great clips out of this thing that will work together and put together a nice thing. But so there'll be more conversations to be had, and it's a very interesting time. It's fun to be in this industry, and I think the impact to provide housing to society is a very rewarding. Good Lord, let's end up the show. This is great to be here.
It's a good place to be, and it's an exciting year to come.
Awesome. Well, if we don't talk to you guys again, happy 2024. We'll catch you guys on the next Rent Report.